Paul Williams to the stage. A brief introduction. Paul started his career in the UK Merchant Navy. He's qualified as a seagoing marine engineer officer. He got a PhD in mechanical engineering from the University College in London, and then he spent a long period in academia where he taught, managed and directed an engine research group, provided consultancy to a range of companies. Then he went back to industry, specializing in global non-road engine emission regulation, certification and conformance. Paul is with Caterpillar from 2008. He currently manages the European Emission Regulatory Affairs there, and he's also the chairman of the Euromod Working Group Non-Road Mobile Machinery. Welcome on stage. The floor is yours, Paul.
Thank you very much, Peter. Okay, here we go. Right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. What I'd like to do this morning, as introduced by Peter, is to take you through the frequently asked questions document, make you aware of this as a resource which you can call upon to use when you have questions related to the implementation of the Stage 5 regulation. Before I go into the FAQ, I'll just give you a little bit more overview of the structure of the Stage 5 regulation in case you're not familiar with it. The Stage 5 regulation itself, unlike previous European non-road regulations, is comprised of several independent parts, which all are linked together. And I think that's something that is very important to understand as you look at the regulation. So the main piece which was decided by the European Parliament and Council is the 2016-1628. That's the main legislative act. And that sets all the limit values, it sets all the primary criteria that you have to comply with when you're looking at the Stage 5, all the introduction dates, all of this sort of material. But alongside this, very importantly, if you actually want to type approve according to the Stage 5 regulation, if you want to actually see the practical implementation and the requirements for that practical implementation, you have to also work with the delegated and implementing acts. There are 3 in total at this point in time. The main delegated act is 2017-654. This contains all the detailed requirements that are needed for the engine to comply with the regulation. It talks about emission control strategies, it talks about test cycles, fuels, all of the stuff you need for type approval. In addition to that, alongside it is the so-called Implementing Act, which is more of the administrative provisions. So this is what you have to fill in to obtain your type approval. And it also talks about the certificates, it talks about the labels that have to go on the engines and so on. To the other side, we have 2017-655. This presentation is not going to concentrate on this, but I think we've got some material on in-service testing coming up later in the agenda this morning. But this is covering what will be required of engine manufacturers going forward, which is to test their engines in the field and to provide results to European Commission and to the individual type approval authorities. That currently only covers 56 to 560 kilowatt variable speed engines, but as we go forward, this will be extended to all the other categories under Stage 5, ranging from rail vehicles to inland waterway vehicles to the very large non-road equipment to the very small non-road equipment. Importantly, when you do look at these regulations, you do need to look at them as a whole. There is a principle in European law that there is a hierarchy that applies, so the Co-Decision Act leads and the others are subservient to that, but also that they don't repeat things very often. So, for example, definitions, if it's defined in the main act, it's not then defined again in the delegated acts. So if you want to understand all the definitions that apply, you've actually got to pull all the acts together and look at the entire list of definitions. Peter mentioned earlier Regulation 96, the UNECE regulation. One interesting point of that is that if you look at the three acts, the 2016-1628, 2017-654 and the 2017-656, in essence, the Regulation 96 at UNECE level pulls those three together into one document. So if you want to see everything in one place, actually the UN R96 regulation is a good shortcut to see everything in one place. Okay, so moving forward. Let's try to move forward. There we go. Okay. As Peter alluded to, unfortunately things are not quite finished in that there are amendments pending for those three delegated and implementing acts that were mentioned previously. So this first round of amendments is primarily correcting cross-reference errors and other editorial issues. It has one or two substantive items in there, for example, some improvements on the preconditioning language and how to deal with not to exceed test requirements when it comes to particulate number. So there are a few substantive items in there, but mostly these are just improvements. These have been adopted by European Commission, and you'll see the dates on these three acts here. I've just photoshopped these. 18th of May and 27th of April is when these were adopted by European Commission, so they're fixed. They're not yet published in the official journal. That should come up in July of this year, after which they take effect. Okay. So getting into the FAQ document itself, this is a shot of the cover of that document. As you can see, it was originally prepared in April 2017, or the preparation was completed in April 2017. It was developed by industry, for industry. We did get European Commission to take a look over it to make sure that we weren't saying anything that was entirely opposite to the views that they may have on this topic. But unfortunately, it's never possible these days to get European Commission to actually sort of sign up and endorse directly a document which has been created by industry. So it is an industry document. It was created as a collaboration between engine and machine associations, and if you look at the bottom here, you can see all the associations involved, some of which are represented in the room today. It's focused on the relevant provisions and obligations for the machine manufacturer, which in the context of the regulation is referred to as the OEM, original equipment manufacturer. Whenever you see the regulation, incidentally, if you see the word manufacturer in the regulation, it means engine manufacturer. The word engine is always omitted, but it means engine manufacturer. If you see the OEM as the abbreviation, it means machine manufacturer. Okay. This guide doesn't tell you how to type approve an engine. It does cover a range of sectors, not all of them. So it's intended to be targeted at construction, agricultural, materials handling, garden machinery, municipal equipment, and gensets, mobile gensets. When we are working on a sort of a next update to this document, which should come out later this year. If you want a copy of the document, it's available free of charge through any of the associations. Because I'm presenting today on behalf of Euromot, I stuck the Euromot website down as your source, but you can equally go to the other associations' websites to obtain this, and it can be downloaded free of charge. Okay. I have to give a disclaimer. These days, in this ever litigious world, I have to give a disclaimer, and the disclaimer really is that if you really want what is the regulation, you have to go to the regulation. It's the only thing that's authentic in law. This is intended to help you. This FAQ is intended to help you, but we do not take responsibility if we guide you in a wrong direction anyway. We don't mean to mislead you. We intend this to be as authentic and accurate as possible. Okay. So what I've done now for the remaining part of this is to dig out particular sections out of this to give you examples. When we get to the end, I will be more than happy to take questions. We have a copy of the guide loaded up onto the laptop at the back, which Peter can go to the back and drive to try and answer questions if you have questions that relate to stage 5. And we'll try and answer them in respect to the FAQ. But I'll just guide you through a few sections that I've drawn out to put into the presentation first, just to get things going. So as you can see, these are all numbered sections. These are all screenshots from the FAQ, and the first one here is talking about what is in the scope. The reason I've put this up is it's quite helpful to ensure that you realise that there's much more in scope than there used to be. And I'm not just talking about types of equipment, but I'm also talking about the fuels that they operate on and the method of ignition. So in the past, 9768 was primarily directed at diesel engines, compression ignition engines, only operated on diesel fuel. Going forward, any engine, whether it's ignited by compression ignition, whether it's ignited by spark ignition, whatever power of the engine from 0 to infinity, and whatever fuel you want to run that on, whether it's LNG, whether it's propane for a forklift truck, whether it's diesel or gasoline or whatever, they're all in there. So it's all covered. They all will require a type approval going forward. In the past, a lot of these categories didn't. So, don't be one of these sectors that gets caught out by the fact that this is coming in and bringing your sector in scope for the first time. The second one, what is an engine? I put that up because this is also a common sort of question, because very often people see an engine over here and an after treatment over here. The reality for this legislation is the engine is that entire system that complies with the emission limits. Right? So whenever the regulation refers to an engine, it's referring to the entirety. So don't think of the engine here and the after treatment here as separate items. They are referred to in entirety. Okay? So when the engine manufacturer has to place on the market a product that complies with the regulation, he has to place on the market that entire system. Interestingly, there are a few bits that are taken out. So gas turbines, for example, are not covered by the regulation, but pretty much any other engine is covered. In terms of the timeline, and I've put a timeline here including the transition scheme. Again, it's a screenshot from the FAQ. It's split here vertically into engines and machines. The majority of the categories that are within scope of this FAQ have a so-called placing on the market date of 1st of January 2019. So obviously we're now approaching that date. You see the little footnote at the bottom, 56 to 130 kilowatts is 1 year later for normal non-road engines. So if you want to consider 56 to 130 kilowatts, you can use exactly the same chart, but just increment each of those dates along the top by 1 year. Okay. From an engine perspective, we have to make sure that anything that doesn't count as a transition engine, and I'll talk about those in a moment, but anything that doesn't count as a transition engine has to be produced and placed on the market by the end of this year, 31st of December, last day. And indeed, if you are to produce transition engines, which can then be used for a temporary period into stage 5, so these are non-stage 5 engines that can be used for the first period of stage 5. If you want to produce those at a manufacturer, you also have to complete production of those before or latest 31st of December of this year. And the other footnote to bear in mind, and especially coming back to that point I made just now, when they talk about the engine production, they mean the whole thing. So the whole thing, including the after treatment, has to be produced by the 31st of December of this year. Okay. When it comes to those transition engines, they can be placed on the market for a further 2 years. But most importantly, you have to look for the second lower section on machines to see how they can be used. Right? And in particular for the machines, and something else I should reinforce here is that the machines are in scope in terms of deadlines for the first time. In 9768 that went before, the deadlines applied only to the engines themselves. So if you had an engine, it didn't matter when you used that engine. You could use it at any point in time. You weren't subject to the same deadlines. But for this regulation, you are subject to the same deadlines. So if you've got any machines with any engines that do not count as transition engines, then they also have to be completed production and placed on the market by the end of this year. So, for example, if you're using any flexibility scheme, okay, under 9768, then all of those have to be placed on the market by the end of this year, and that's a hard cut-off. Right? They don't qualify to be placed on the market at a later date. As far as continuing production of machines, and for example, a machine with a stage 4 engine, then if that stage 4 engine has been produced as to comply with the transition engine requirements, then that can be built into a machine for the first 18 months in the general case. So for the first 18 months of stage 5, you can continue to produce with that engine. And then you have a further 6 months to get that machine onto the market. What counts as a transition engine or transition machine? Here we have, again from the FAQ, a table of what is permitted. Basically, it's always the immediate previous stage. So if you've got something of the immediate previous stage, it can be counted, it can be used as a transition engine. That transition engine will require a month and year marking so that the surveillance authorities can ensure that it was actually built at the right time to qualify as a transition engine. And the machines themselves, then, if they're built in that 18-month period or they're placed in the market in that 18-month period, they also have to have the month and year marking that goes with their production date. And the production dates are always defined as the end of production. So it has to be a completed machine, a completed engine. There's a few carve-outs. I won't go into details. If you're interested, we can look at those in more detail later. Now, given that the engine is a complete unit, inclusive of its after-treatment, there can be requirements to not, or there can be commercial pressures to not have to consolidate that engine and after-treatment together in one location before you ship it to the customer. So there is a provision in here called separate shipment. That provision also means that you can take an engine direct from the engine production plant, and in that context I'm talking about the engine without its after-treatment, and then you can take the after-treatment from the after-treatment production plant and you can ship those separately to the end customer. Right? There are certain things that have to happen to ensure that is allowed, including the fact that the engine manufacturer has to place the order for the after treatment before he ships the rest of the engine to the customer. So other things that particularly OEMs could get involved in the initial stages as we're developing and implementing stage 5 is field testing. From a field test perspective, this is where an engine manufacturer is supplying an engine to a machine manufacturer, and that machine manufacturer is then going to test that machine in the field. It possibly goes out to a valued customer who can provide you with some feedback as to how that machine operates in the field, so that information can then get fed back to the machine manufacturer and back to the engine manufacturer to reflect how the product is performing. So the regulation does permit this explicitly. Unfortunately, there are a few caveats that are put in there by the regulators, not which we sought as industry, but they were put there to try and hold us to account. And the core one of those is that that engine has to remain the property of the engine manufacturer during that process. So there can be other financial arrangements, such as leasing, but the ownership of the engine during a field test has to remain with the engine manufacturer in order to comply with the regulation. It's a pain, but that is a fact of life. And the engine manufacturer also has to pre-advise the approval authority of each engine by serial number that goes out for this purpose. Right? That is then they are then on a 2-year time limit to get that engine either removed from the market or brought into conformity. And if they need it, they can apply for a further 2 years extension, so a maximum of 4 years. So there are provisions to ensure that field testing can take place, but you have to meet the regulatory requirements for that. So that was a few select items that I've taken out of that FAQ. I want to make you aware, I'm not sure if any of you are involved in this sector, Euromot is working on other FAQs. There's one already produced for the rail sector. There's another one being prepared for inland waterway. And the same group of associations that were mentioned earlier are also working on a further FAQ for market surveillance authorities to tell them how to check whether a stage 5 product is correct or not.